Hello, welcome to episode 4 of our Doctor Who rewatch retrospective of the 2005 reboot. So this episode was Aliens of London. I'm Robert.
And I'm Aaron.
So I think this episode, is fair to say, has
a reputation.
A reputation. And perhaps I don't think it's unfair to say tonal issues.
I didn't. So, I'm trying to think if we should talk about it as in like in a start to finish manner, or just start with the bit everyone wants us to talk about, which is the farting aliens in Downing Street.
I think that's kind of, there's a way of looking at the episode as a whole, because when I was watching the episode, going into it, I was kind of like, I sort of remember this episode being kind of fun. It's obviously not going into it, I was like, it's obviously not a very serious episode. But then, and so on that basis, a little bit in a similar way of like Love and Monsters, I was kind of like, well, it's a silly episode, so I just enjoy it as a silly episode. But then when I was watching it, I was like, and this is why I say tonal issues, I feel like it can't decide whether it's a serious episode or a silly episode.
Well, there's actually quite a lot of drama in weirdly enough. Again, like Love and Monsters. I actually hadn't made that connection, but they have exactly the same issue there. From my perspective, so the first 3 episodes, as I've mentioned, I hadn't seen in years.
Yeah.
This I actually rewatched fairly recently because I put the DVD in for Dalek, which has these 2 episodes on it.
Yeah, they used to do that with 3.
Exactly, and I started just watching it the first 5 minutes, and I did end up watching the whole 2-parter. So my memory of this was, wow, this is so much better than everyone makes it out to be. Because my expectations were really low. I went into this rewatch with higher expectations and was then disappointed. And I'm sort of in the middle of this episode. I don't think it's terrible. I want to say that up front. And I do think people overpronounce the problems with it. But I went into this rewatch ready to be like, oh, you're all getting hung up on the farting. It's a really good episode. Yeah. It's not really good.
No, it's not. It has, and oddly enough, I kind of think, almost again a similar sort of way to Love and Monsters, it would almost be a better episode if it either committed to serious drama or committed to being really silly. But it can't. There are a few scenes where it's like, this is actually decently tense. I mean, you have, I think in particular, I think the standout scene in that regard is when you have Harriet Jones, MP for Iredale North, hiding in the cupboard in the cabinet room, and you don't see the Slitheen directly, and it's like, that is absolute sort of classic horror thing of, if you don't see the, I mean, the big one, obviously, Alien, you don't really see the alien that much, and it's like, that creates a great suspense, particularly given the limitations of the special effects of the time. And so there's scenes like that where they're being actually really clever with how they're shooting it, how they're framing it, the blue light sort of coming into the cupboard and everything.
I've always loved the blue light of the Slitheen Mask. I think it's really like atmospheric and very distinct. As I've always thought that was very good.
I think the sound's pretty solid as well. It's got this kind of otherworldly so there's things like that where you're like, this is actually really smart television making. This is, you've shot this really cleverly, you've built the sound design. I will say, I think, and I've always thought, the practical Slitheen looked great.
Dave, I was going to mention that because I was going to mention it at the end, because they obviously only see them before the end. But yes, no, the Slitheen costumes look fantastic. I think my memory is that moving in them is a little bit cumbersome at times. Sometimes you can tell, oh, that's an actor who can't really see. But at least for this episode, where they're not really doing a whole lot, they look very present, very realistic in a lot of ways. And
but when they switch to the CG doubles, they're not great.
Wobbling.
That
I excuse. So my suspense, as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned this in like Rose and End of the World. my level of suspension of disbelief for CGI is extremely low.
Yeah.
And I can forgive the Slitheen in this episode only because I don't know what it looks like when an alien is, because they're kind of growing and shrinking as they come out of the disguises.
Yeah.
So I kind of forgive the wobbliness, but I know that there's some shots of them in the next episode where they're just moving normally.
Shot.
Yes, which is not good.
But I think that's where I have an issue with the CG is, like you say, if you have no reference, fine, but we have a reference because there's the practical suits which look great, and I kind of feel like if you wanted to take this, because like I say, you could either go just lean into the silliness or try and make it a really actually play to the serious drama. If you wanted to go in that direction, I would say don't ever show them actually coming out of the people, out of the people's suits, because they aren't able to really do it in a way that is scary. It's much better to have that off screen, or do it in, as you sometimes like, in a shadow on a wall or things like that, where it's slightly less, the fidelity is less important, and then make very careful use of the practical suits. But as it is, and so with the other thing I was going to mention with the practical suits, I think the sound design with the practical suits is great. There's that sound effect when they blink.
I knew you were going to mention that. Yeah,
and it really sells it as like an organic. The eyes of the Slitheen look great. They look really like actually organic. But it's got that weird tonal thing of like, there's scenes where I'm like, this could be out of a genuinely quite tense, serious drama. And then there's the farting.
Well, see, I think the tonal problems are actually encapsulated perfectly in the first unmasking scene, because they're all farting and being silly, and you're like, okay, this is toilet humour. And then there's the bit where the guy's like, I'm going to relieve you of command, and then there's a really dramatic musical cue, and the actor, I don't know his name, but the sort of the head Slitheen actor, the guy playing the Prime Minister, he gives like a quite an intimidating glare, and I just don't buy it, because there's just been a minute of farting.
And it's weird because, and I think where the two intersect really in a really interesting way, and what make me slightly wonder whether they kind of realised that the farting was going to come across as ridiculously as it does. I mean, you sort of assume you put like farting as being like the quality, the main thing of your alien. People are going to think it's silly, but there's a bit where in order to indicate that the police officer is a Slitheen, they have him kind of, having gas and sort of uncomfortably shifting, and that is played as like a sinister beat, and it's like, oh, he's farting, so he must be, and it's like,
I was thinking the exact same thing. I feel like we're exactly on the same page with this story, because it was exactly that. It was like, so that indicates that he's a villain, but his tummy's grumbling a little bit, and they even, it's not a full-on fart, it's a little upset tummy, so it's this kind of half although I do want to say that just to go on the Rusty Davies praise train, I'm a complete shill for him. Whenever, and obviously we will get to this point, but when we criticise later showrunners' writings, we're usually criticising like, this is sheer incompetence from top to bottom in some regard. In this case, he establishes that the monsters fart, which is ridiculous.
Yes.
But he still uses that as a narrative device to, like, wordlessly communicate that this person is a villain. So even when his creative decisions are baffling, he's still writing it really well.
And I had that same sort of thought when I was watching that scene. It's like, I can't work out whether I think this is ridiculous or brilliant, because it's like, on the face of it, it's absurd, because it's like, the key of it being sinister is the guy's farting, but at the same time it's like, you've established that, and it is quite a sort of subtle way of doing it. It's not completely unjustified. And again, that I think is the thing with the whole episode. And actually, I think this is almost a more interesting episode than I thought it was going to be, because especially, I mean, I think I've said this before, there's a slight difference between watching an episode just to watch the episode and watching it with the thing of like, I've got to now talk about it. And so I think whenever I've watched this in the past, I've kind of engaged with it on the level of just like, as kind of... I actually really like the Slitheen.
Yes.
This is another thing. I've always... People kind of go, oh, they're ridiculous. I like them. I think they're beautifully designed, and they're kind of fun.
But I want to talk about them more in a second. You finish up your point.
And so on that, I'm like, I was kind of expecting to just engage with it again on that kind of level of like, it's a sort of run around and a bit fun. And then when I was watching it this time with the view of, well, I've got to sort of say stuff and more critically looking at it, I was like, there's actually quite a lot of interesting stuff going on here. And it's an episode sort of with a identity crisis of it can't work out whether it's serious or silly.
I think actually this episode kind of... I think so far season 1 of Doctor Who, as we've mentioned, is kind of, in some senses, been perfect in the sense of establishing characters, establishing tone, setting, all of that stuff. The episodes haven't been perfect, but it's laid the groundwork excellently. I think this is the first instance of this is the first season, we don't quite know what we're doing yet, because you have a monster that is clearly, designed with children in mind, very, very silly in a sort of political espionage story that, I don't know about you, when I was a kid I didn't grasp any of what was going on. I think I would always skip this episode because there's basically no Slitheen in it, and I would just go to the Slitheen running around the hallways. So it's kind of, it doesn't quite know where it's pitching itself, and I think that's not just a problem with the episode but a broader issue of, is this show for children? Is it for adults? Is it for both? How do we make it about both? And I think the Slitheen and the way they're used in this story just kind of embody that kind of confusion, which is also why I think, I agree with you, they are great monsters, and they're then used in the Sarah Jane adventures because they then realise, right, Slitheen are too childish, so we'll put them in that, and they work much better there, I think.
I also think even within this it's the same series, they come back. I obviously I knew that because it's Eccleston again, but I think I've only just now clocked properly that they bring the Slitheen back within one season. But I think Boomtown and was it just one episode? Boomtown is works maybe better because they do then, that is a sillier episode. I say that there is the whole like judge, jury, executioner bit, but anyway, we'll get on to that when we get to that episode. But I think they kind of figured out a bit more what the Slitheen are, and they do probably arguably work better in the Sarah Jane adventures. But it is a weird episode. I think this episode kind of teeters on that brink a bit more. I think next episode, and we'll see, I guess, when we watch it, but I think the next episode kind of goes over the cliff into kind of slightly ridiculous. This episode, I think you could arguably still recover this episode into the second part being a serious thing, because this episode is more, there's some scenes that are serious, some that are silly, rather than being all one or the other. But it's still not without issue in that regard. I think it is a very confused episode.
Yeah, and I don't think... I'm glad that we... because we were debating before we did this whether we were going to watch two-parters all at once and then do one episode on them. But we decided it would be better, since this is a retrospective, to watch them separately. I'm glad we did it this way, because this is thrown into stark relief. I do not think this works on its own. I was left wanting more by the end of it, but only because I was like, I really don't think any of the themes have been explored adequately. I feel like very little has actually happened. This has been all set up. And it's been fine, but I'm left wanting a lot more. Just because I feel it was a little quite insubstantial. I
think that's fair. There's quite a lot of sort of threads and things or not even really threads, because that is one thing. It's like, if you're doing a two-parter, you do want to set up threads that you're then obviously going to extend and then resolve in the second part. But this almost doesn't, other than obviously the main plot line, it has things that come up like obviously the Doctor and Rose coming back at the start and it being 12 months rather than 12 hours, that, I mean, it works, like it's serviceable, but I feel like it's not that believable in some senses, because I was watching and I was thinking, I feel like Jackie goes quite quickly from, oh my god, you've been gone for a year and you won't tell me where you've been, to just being like, I guess Rose is back now and let's have a party about the aliens.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned that, because that's made me kind of realise that I was very enthusiastic about this episode within like the first 10 minutes.
Yeah.
I thought the pacing was really good, and I really liked all the stuff with Jackie and Rose and all that. And I remember thinking, I remember thinking that what I was going to say when we got to the episode was, this episode is really Russell Davies planting his flag in the ground and being like, this is my Doctor Who, this is about domestics and people and stuff. But that's kind of only there for 10 minutes, and then, obviously you're still at the house, but they're not really talking very much. You've got a tiny bit with Mickey talking about like how people thought you murdered him, but it's mostly played for jokes. That kind of fizzles out, which is disappointing, because it was very, very interesting. Yeah, and again, I think it's a little bit of a tonal issue. Like you say, it's like, on the one hand, it wants to explore those things, on the other hand, it wants to play them for laughs, and you kind of, for those sort of things, you kind of can't do both, or if you do, it's a very tricky line to walk, and I don't think it is walked. No. I think part of the issue, actually, is there's quite a bit more plot, and, well, not necessarily plot, but like, how do I explain this? So the Slitheen plan, we're introduced to it part of the way through, because the spaceship crashing is not the beginning. And Russell T Davies, I think he does a very good job of naturally and clearly explaining what has happened. Like, here's your daily Chibnall bashing. You know, in Legend of the Sea Devils, that's a fairly convoluted mystery, and it's just fucking thrown at you. I have no idea what happened in that episode, even though I'm sure it could be explained in a way that makes sense. Russell Davies, he paces the information very carefully. You know what's going on. Exactly. And it's a little convoluted, but he explains it very well. But that takes quite a lot of time out of the episode, and I've now forgotten why I'd mentioned that fact. But I think it was... I remember now, because of all the themes that aren't being explored. I think the reason they're not being explored is because a lot of the time is going into explaining the Slitheen's fairly convoluted plan, which, although it makes sense, it just isn't that interesting. There's also this kind of thing of the Slitheen's plan, as much as you say, it's clear what they've done and it's clear why they've done it to some degree, but from a narrative standpoint, in terms of, as you say, how much of that episode it takes up to ultimately become, and we can discuss this probably more in the next part because it become more relevant, but it's sort of not that big of a deal at the end of the day. The decoy spaceship and things like that's all to get the alien experts to Downing Street so they can kill them, and then they don't, and well they do, they kill everyone but the Doctor. But either way, it's like that doesn't actually play into the... Exactly, that's essentially 45 minutes to get the Doctor into Downing Street, so that you can then do the rest of the episode, the next part. And so actually, in terms of what happens of substance in this episode, there's not that much. And there are things... I mean, to be positive about it, there are things that Davies obviously always does well, and I think there's no exception in this episode in regard to the general kind of vibe of, like when people are having parties and things, there's a sense of sort of things going on. It feels sort of somewhat realistic in that regard, but that's all frankly window dressing. It's very good window dressing, but it doesn't and even outside the writing, in terms of the set design and things, you still have the Rose missing posters sort of in frame at various points. That's all good stuff, and it contributes in a really solid episode. It really contributes to the sense of world building, and it's still good that it's here. But the plot is quite thin, and so it's like, okay, it's nice that that's there, but it's not really contributing to a really solid overall product. No, exactly. And I also think a lot of the positive qualities that Davies always brings are still here, but he's not doing anything special with them. Like, the characters are still strong. You know, like the Doctor reacting positively to a crash landing is totally on brand. You know, Jackie's fantastic.
Yes, I mean, Jackie. Yeah.
Again, small frustration. I wanted more of that. I loved that scene at the beginning. You know, she's angry and then she's crying with Rose. I was like, I want more of this character, you know, and that's what we haven't explored yet.
It's a weird thing where Davies is like, this, you know, his Doctor Who is, and does generally continue to be, and does this well, but in the context of this particular episode, it's, this iteration of Doctor Who is going to be about domestic issues, and you start doing that, and it's like, actually now it's a run-around alien episode.
Well, it's not even a run-around, it's... the Doctor is popping about, sort of being like, okay, what are the... It's just a lot of sitting there thinking about, trying to figure out what the aliens are doing.
Yeah.
Again, well-paced information, but it's just...
It's not that consequential.
What's it all in aid of? Yeah. And it is ultimately just getting him in that building.
And the mystery, such as it is, of decoy alien by real aliens, like, it's a cute idea, but it is not so sufficiently interesting in and of itself to warrant spending the time on exploring.
Oh yes, it's not like with Blink, because Blink is essentially just 45 minutes of trying to figure out what the hell's going on, but it's
an interesting mystery,
and it's also very atmospheric, and it does a lot more with it. And again, I feel like there really is a way to do. The Doctor is off investigating this stuff while Rose is experiencing real life. Now she's been out into space, but it just doesn't. It's very
they don't mesh.
Yeah, it's very much,
we're doing this.
Yeah.
Okay, that's bit's over now, and now we're doing this, and neither is fully explored.
Or even then, I'd be happy if you just put the Doctor off. He's doing his own thing. Get lots of time with Rose, but it prioritises the Doctor, which I think is strange.
That's a fair point. It prioritises the Doctor, and the Doctor isn't really doing anything that's so interesting that you're like, I'm really glad. You feel like there's something more interesting happening off camera, which is a shame. And it does feel to me like, the whole domestic stuff just gets resolved way too quickly. And more broadly, like I was saying, there are themes that are kind of latently there, but don't really get explored. Like, one of the ones I was thinking, you've got some degree of, I hesitate to call it critique, because this is the problem, is there really isn't a critique there. It's just a sort of pointing at a thing. But you have this sort of notion of mass surveillance. You have that theme of, because they're scanning all communications for mentions of the Doctor and things like that. And so there's a sort of hint of, yes, this is... And in an episode where a spaceship, a flying craft, crashes into a major city landmark... It's got big 9/11.
Well, this becomes much more apparent in the next episode, which is why I have a suspicion, and I'm interested to see if I eat these words, that the next episode will be much better, because they hit that nail on the head. Like the speech. I don't know if you remember the next episode, but the Prime Minister gives a speech about aliens have weapons of mass destruction, and it's literally, he's a stand-in for Tony Blair. There's been a catastrophe, a major city landmark has been destroyed, and we've just discovered these people have weapons of mass destruction. It really hits the 9/11 parallel on the head. Here it's just, and I guess that's the issue. This is all planting seeds, and none of them really grow. And part of me wonders if are all two-parters just like that? Are we going to sort of find in this rewatch that actually most part ones are fairly dull, and it's the part twos that have all the resolutions, or is it a problem with just this one? I
think there are definitely. I mean, it'd be interesting to see rewatching them critically whether that is perhaps the case, but I think definitely there are ones that are like that. The other one that comes to mind, which is technically a three-parter, is the Monks in Capaldi's run, because I remember us saying at the time when we watched that, when it aired, discussing afterwards the first episode, going, I mean, that was kind of interesting, but it will be entirely contingent on the payoff. Yes. And I think this is one of those, I feel that there are two-parters that aren't like that, but whether that's I've just retroactively... And I think that's the thing where we decided when we were having the discussion about, do we treat the two-parters as one episode and discuss them all in one go, or do we do, as we are doing, one episode versus and then the next episode as they would have aired. I think the benefit of doing it that way is you do get to go, well, how does it work as a standalone thing? Because certainly whenever I think of two-parters in retrospect, I think of them as one thing.
Exactly, but you'd had to watch them one at a time.
You have to wait a week. I mean, we're not even going to, we're going to finish recording this, and then we're going to watch that, and then we'll record it. So, that's a much shorter time. But yeah, when they aired, you'd have a week between them. So you'd have that to keep you going for a week.
But a point I do want to make on that, though, is that setup is a lot more interesting if you don't already know the story.
True.
And again, I may eat these words when I get to it, but my memory of Silence in the Library and Forest of the Dead, which I've rewatched a few times since it aired, is that when the first time I watched that story, I was like, both parts are 10 out of 10. But on a rewatch, I was like, I actually like the first part quite a lot less because it's just asking a lot of questions, and I know what the questions are. So I want to get to the payoffs. I mean, on the whole, obviously that story is still going to end up being better than this one.
Yeah.
But I do think that may have the same problem, and I think this would work better.
If you
still
didn't,
not great, but better if you didn't already know what the mystery was going to be. Because I did, I couldn't be as invested in it, so I was sort of thinking, I want a little bit of... I want something conclusive. I want something to really, hit me, and it didn't, because it's saving all that for next time.
Yeah, no, I had a similar sort of thing of, like, I was watching it and I was kind of preempting stuff, because I was obviously I've seen this episode a few times, both parts a few times, and like, there are things that are being set up as mysteries that you're like, well, I know what happens, and I do wonder whether that does impact the aspect of the decoy spaceship and everything, all the kind of the in the sense that there is a mystery here. It's not a complex mystery, and so because we both know what the answer to it is, there isn't enough, because some mysteries you can rewatch because they're sufficiently intricate that you kind of enjoy the way it unfolds. This, I don't think, really has that. So interesting. There is an interesting point, because it's one of those ones again where, I mean, we kind of talked about this in the very first episode with Rose, where you can look at it as, how does it work as a pilot for a new show? Having not been familiar, does it serve that purpose? And how does it just work as a bit of television? In a similar way with this, it's like, how does this work just coming to it fresh, and how does it work? It doesn't have great rewatch.
Well, I could definitely say confidently it's not very rewatchable. No. But I was trying to think while watching it, because obviously the scene when the Slitheen, who up until this point you don't know are aliens, how they sort of laugh, they chuckle in like that cabinet room. I remember thinking, okay, so if I'm watching this for the first time, a body's been recovered from the spaceship, and then a bunch of politicians laugh. I know they're Slitheen, but it's like, would I maybe assume the politicians are in on it? And it's like, that could be quite interesting to think about, actually. And then when they unmask as aliens, I could be like, okay, so are there two species trying to invade? But I'm not asking those questions because I know what the answer is.
Yeah,
I do think there'd be more to carry you through this story if you didn't already know the mystery.
I think maybe in the instance of, like, the politician laughing in the cabinet and stuff like that, obviously if you don't know beforehand, there's a little more intrigue there. I do wonder again whether, because there's elements of the mystery that are very hammy, they're very kind of played up, the laughing and the, even when the Slitheen are revealed with what's, I was going to try and remember the name of that
Blondfelt Plasimir de Slitheen.
Yeah, that's the one.
Could imagine not knowing that.
Yeah, it is essential Doctor Who lore. You're basically a fake fan if you don't know. That I've already forgotten
so someone in the comments name all of the Slitheen in this episode. Don't look it up.
She's got that kind of very hammy kind of, has somebody been naughty? And it's weird because it's like, especially thinking in terms of Boomtown later on, I think her character as a Slitheen is the standout Slitheen intentionally, because obviously they bring her back. And so I like that characterization, but it's fighting with that tonal thing again of like. I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be sinister or funny.
Yeah, which again is why they work so much better in the Sarah Jane Adventures. Because they keep that exact same characterization of them being all giggly and kind of, you know, like children having fun. And it works so much better in that kind of silly story. So with that, it'll be interesting to see how they work in Boomtown, because I cannot for the life of me remember if they tone them down or make them even sillier in that story. It's been so long since I've watched it.
Yeah, because that was the thing, was when I first mentioned Boomtown, my immediate thing was they commit to the silliness, but then I remembered there is a moral question in that episode, and it's not a superficial moral question. Like it is a pretty solid one of like, does the Doctor get to just go, oh, I just took you to the gallows, I didn't actually execute you? That's an interesting moral question. So it's like, yeah, no, they kind of didn't, but I my feeling, and again it'd be interesting when we do get to the episode, is that they manage that dichotomy better. In this episode, I feel like it's like, I kind of feel like I'm almost watching two episodes that have been spliced together of a version of it that was sinister and dramatic, and a version that's just fully silly.
Or maybe, for me, it just feels more like they knew what they were going for and they just missed the mark, and then next time they knew how to pitch it a little bit better. I want to talk about something, and I may say this and then immediately regret putting it out into the world, but sod it, I've been thinking about it. With, like, the Slitheen, and you were talking about the characterization of, like, Margaret.
Yeah. And
she's all like, oh, has someone been naughty, and all of that stuff. And that kind of cheekiness to them. When you combine that with the whole idea of they take off their skin suits and stuff like that, there's this bizarre, like, sexual, like, sort of, it's implying some kind of, you know what I mean?
No, I know, like, what you mean.
Do you know what I mean?
And,
and like the whole naughty thing, that's not a, that's a deliberately chosen word.
Yeah.
And there is, you know, the undressing thing, I'm definitely not making that up.
Yeah.
That's the whole sort of idea of taking off the skin suits, and they really hammer home this idea, this slightly uncomfortable sexual quality about it.
There is a kind of Foucaultian psychosexual element to the Slitheen.
Well, do you know why I mention it, actually? Because I never noticed that when I was a kid, obviously. But about a year ago, I watched a clip from the Sarah Jane Adventures. Sorry that we keep jumping between shows, but I think it is quite relevant. Yeah, because they're a big part of that show. And it's the bit when they unmask themselves at the end of the part one of the school episode, so their first appearance in that show. And Maria is hiding under a table from one of the teachers, and the teacher is being, as the Selena, very sort of like, oh, I can smell a little girl in this room. And he's like, oh, no, no. And then he starts doing the unzipping thing, and I was like, as an adult, this has strong, like, paedophilic connotations of, like, a teacher is undressing in front of a student, and I was like, maybe that's just like an accident, but seeing this, I was like, I think this is intentional. And again, minor point of frustration, I think in theory that is almost slightly genius, because nudity and sex and undressing are very primal cultural anxieties, and you know, like how the monster in Alien is like designed to be phallic, and stuff like that. I almost feel like it's trying to go for that. It's trying to get into your head and with tapping into these primal anxieties you have, but it's not actually working.
No, partly because they make it a joke.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of potential there, because it works really good in Sarah Jane Adventures. Like, I was deeply uncomfortable watching that scene.
Well, I mean, in the second part of this story, you know, when they're in, you know, when they think they've won, they have the line of "victory should be naked." Yeah, and there is this underlying kind of like.
And there's another bit of that as well when they're in the lift, and it's like, oh, I need to be naked, and the other one says your body is magnificent. And I'm rattling off now. When the Slitheen swaps disguises, he said, oh, I quite like being that guy. He had a wife, a mistress, and a farm boy. And I said to you at the time, it's a very Russell T Davies line. And, you know, side note, if that was written at 22 episodes of Doctor, it was like, oh, you're forcing the gauge. But no, like, there's quite a lot of it, actually.
Yeah, there is this kind of...
very strange.
Again, it's sort of one of these things where there's some themes there that they just leave unexplored. I think this is the first time I've watched this episode and felt frustrated by it, because normally, like I said, I just watch it on the level of it's kind of silly, whatever. Watching it critically, I feel like there's a much better episode in there that actually wouldn't be that, because it's very easy to be like, there's a better episode in there. Like, there's a lot of things you can watch and be like, oh, well, if they rework this and this and this and this and this, it'd be a better episode. Well, at that point, you're writing a different episode. This, I don't feel like it's unreasonable to say that it's almost the better episode.
One rewrite that picked, okay, we're doing this and we're not doing this and stuff like that could have made it 1,000 times better.
There's definitely I think this has to be the most analysis that this episode's ever been subjected to.
I do want to say, just in praise of this episode, I still stand by this, that I dislike people who dismiss it as it's the stupid farting aliens episode, oh god, what was Russell Davies thinking? There's a lot of stuff. Well, I was going to say there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot of stuff almost going on here. It's still not good, but it's not the Chibnall bad of this is just lazy, bad, stupid ideas. This is trying lots of things. And in places it is still well written. It is worthy of talking about and analysing, but it ultimately still doesn't work.
And I think there's a level of like you say, words would be helpful, I find, in expressing a point. As a critique, that there are farting aliens is a bad critique, because there's no reason actually inherently that farting aliens couldn't be a solid story. Now, I don't think they've achieved that in this episode, but in and of itself, that's not a good critique. And I do think it's a more interesting critique to be like, well, how have they done? Because I mean, like we were saying, the use of the farting as a kind of, or the gas generally as a kind of indicator of, oh, you should be kind of uneasy about this character, isn't totally ridiculous. And I feel like there is a way that you could have done that. Actually, even keeping the gas and keeping the farting where it wouldn't come across as ridiculous. It's because the episode itself acknowledges that it's ridiculous that it is obviously ridiculous. But I think if they played it straight or less camp, which obviously asking Russell T Davies to play things less camp is a challenge perhaps, but you could almost do it. Like,
well, I'm curious to think actually, because curious to ask even, because we both agree that Rose is a very camp episode, but we think that it works ultimately. Why do you think, why does burping wheelie bins work, but farting aliens don't? Do you think it is just because Rose is also trying to do the family drama, domestic stuff?
Well, I think you've kind of got... in Rose, you've maybe got more depth to it. And so where you have the slightly ridiculous sci-fi elements, they're kind of established in a way that, I think maybe this is it. So Rose is camp, but it is not camp in universe.
Okay.
Whereas this is camp in universe, because the aliens themselves are actively acknowledging, oh, it's silly that we're farting. Whereas the wheelie bin does not do a side to the camera of being like, what am I like? Like, it's...
And even with Auton Mickey, when Rose gets in the car and he's sitting there with this... Pizza. Yeah, it's like, Rose doesn't, like, turn to camera and go, the hell is wrong with my boyfriend? With a Seinfeld...
So I do wonder whether maybe that's it, is that I do think to do camp well, you shouldn't necessarily acknowledge the camp within the episode.
Well, there's an interest that touches on actually I can't for life remember the guy's name, but the guy who wrote Airplane, which is obviously a very silly comedy film, he said that the key to writing a good parody is the characters cannot be laughing at the joke. The characters are in a complete life or death situation. This is the most important thing, and they are taking it completely seriously. It's the audience job to laugh at it. So I think you saying that it's That's the difference. Yeah. I think that is possible.
I think that's an element of it, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like sort of stand-up comics who laugh at their own jokes. Like it can be funny if they do it like accidentally or like very occasionally, but if they're really telegraphing to the audience of like, you should be laughing now, it dampens the sort of thing. And I don't know, maybe this episode struggles with that a little bit of like and you wonder why, because clearly there's no need to telegraph to the audience that farting aliens is kind of ridiculous. That's self-evident. So there is a sense of like, why does it feel the need to do that?
I think, and it's part of the characterization of the Slitheen, isn't it? Which is good. I like the Slitheen. I think they are very fun, and I like that they're not really taking the invasion seriously and stuff like that. But yeah, it just doesn't gel with the rest of the episode. Taking itself a lot more seriously, and I think possibly also the characters around them taking it more seriously.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point actually, that I do like that the Slitheens don't take themselves seriously, because I think it signals they really don't expect to have any challenge in taking over the Earth. They see it as a very trivial matter, so they're not worried about it. They are just like, hey, let's enjoy ourselves. So in that sense, that's decent characterization. And I do think one of the things that, one of the reasons I do genuinely like the Slitheen as aliens is their humour. Like they are
and also the whole turning anyone into like a disguise that you could wear. That's a really cool idea.
Cool, yeah. And there are, like we were saying in this episode, there are elements where that comes across as genuinely sinister. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like maybe if the other characters were more consistent in their... Because obviously they're afraid of the Slitheen when they like unmask themselves. But when they're in their human suits and they're doing their farting and they're giggling, the other humans obviously like not unrealistically kind of respond of being like, what is going on here? But that's, I feel, maybe on a sort of meta level undercuts this. Sorry, Joe. Well, I was just going to say, so I feel like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like there's maybe a level on which, a bit like you're saying with Aeroplane, where the characters in it shouldn't be laughing, that the Slitheen should be amused because they're like, this is an easy thing, this is, we're not worried about this. But the other characters really shouldn't acknowledge the ridiculousness of the thing, and that's where maybe the farting undercuts things, because it forces the humans to kind of be like, what's going on?
I think also farting is just, it has connotations of sort of lowbrow humour. I think even if it was just retained to stomach grumbling, I think that could be ominous, because that could have connotations of hunger and like, oh, it's going to eat you or something like that. But farting is just toilet humour, it is for little babies. So I think it may just be... to undercut my point earlier, it may actually just be as simple as the farting is a bad idea.
maybe the real critique all along just is that farting is silly and they shouldn't have it.
The only other theory I want to throw out there is that Rose is extremely campy, but as we said in our review of it, the plot is so completely unimportant, whereas this is a very plot-heavy episode, so it may also just be that you're kind of being forced to focus on it and forced to take the silly thing very seriously. This is the most in-depth analysis of why the farting aliens don't work. I think most people just leave it as it's cringe.
This is the most I have ever thought about this episode, ever. I think probably cumulatively in my entire life up to this point, I have thought about this episode less than I have.
Same. Yeah, so if you've got no more substantial things, I've got a few little things I want to mention.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the main thing, just thinking back to when I was a kid, I do want to mention I loved the Slitheen as a child. The farting didn't bother me. I thought they were so cool. So I think in that sense they may have been a sensible choice for the episode, because they did appeal to children, definitely. But obviously watching it now as an adult, that doesn't work. I like the little bits of continuity in this story. Like, I like that Unit appears. The Doctor mentions he used to work for them in a very non-invasive way, which again is what the series has been doing very well with referencing the classic series. Like, I didn't notice it when I was a kid, but it is directly calling back to the Pertwee era.
There's this sense of the continuity of the classic series is done very well because it's brought in bit by bit in a sort of organic way of, like, also being introduced as new information to the viewer, that basically the classic series could not exist and this would still make sense as world building. It would just be off-screen world building rather than a reference to the classic thing.
Exactly. That's very well done, and that's really hard to do. I was also thinking, in terms of characterization, I know a lot of people who don't like Rose, and I've never gotten it, but rewatching this series with a critical eye, I've been looking out for things. This is the first episode where I'm starting to see, like, her selfishness. Although it's still not bothering me, I am now starting to notice it. Like, she doesn't... I mean, I like it so far because I think it's very believable for someone her age. But, you know, she is entirely dismissive of Mickey. She says she misses him and then a second later pulls away from a kiss that he's about to give her. You know, she's not... She's still thinking about the Doctor, even when her family are, like, distraught that that she's been gone for so long. I can see why. I'm starting to see why. I hope I don't start disliking her, because I like selfish characters in general. Because I think they're interesting to watch.
It can be... I mean, that's the thing. I think... it's interesting you raised that point. I hadn't sort of thought of it very directly, but... thinking back to the last time I watched this episode, which, as with all of the first series, is about a year ago, I do kind of vaguely recall thinking this is the only episode where I kind of don't like Rose. Like, I do sort of think you come across a bit... I don't know whether it is the selfishness or just the general thing. It's a bit like... I find her maybe a bit grating in this episode. The other thing that Rose does in this episode, and I think this is the first instance of this in Doctor Who, far as I'm aware anyway, where... And it introduces a thing that then is pervasive throughout the entirety of the reboot run of Doctor Who, of Rose having this sense of being in some way really special, as though she's the only person the Doctor's ever travelled with. There's the bit of the scene on the rooftop where she's like, "I'm the only human who knows that aliens exist," and it kind of came to me when I was watching that scene of where I don't like that trope. I mean, obviously it's not fair to call it a trope at this point, but it becomes a trope of companions having this very negative reaction to discovering that they're not the only person the Doctor's travelled with. On the one hand, here I think it's arguably good characterization because it sets things up well for school reunion. Because it doesn't then come out of nowhere. So in that sense, it's good characterization. But on the other hand, I was like, why would a companion ever assume that they were the only person the Doctor's travelled with when they know that he's like 900 years old? Now, I think, again, in this instance, you can kind of forgive it because actually this is the scene that Rose finds out the Doctor is 900 years old. But later on, where you have companions and they know the Doctor is like super old, why on earth would they assume that he had never before met a human who could even remotely match up to their...
I had never thought about that, to be honest. I think partly because, to my recollection, it's not often that the companions think they're special, it's that the writer thinks that they're very special.
That's certainly a problem.
But yeah, there is a quality to that. I mean, there is in general a kind of a lot of writers, and Rusty Davies, I think they're all guilty of this. This is possibly the only problem shared with all the showrunners. They hype their companions as if they're better than all the other ones that have come before them. Like, Rusty Davies does it with Rose and a little bit with Donna as well. Poor Martha. Fuck knows Moffat does it, and Chibnall is starting to do it with Yaz, where, this plank of wood who has certainly...
she's the most amazing person the Doctor's ever met.
She certainly ran away from an explosion at the end of Battle of Ranskor-Av-Kolos. She certainly did that. And she wrote What Would the Doctor Do on her finger, which, oh, wow.
And she's inarguably been present for the episode.
She has certainly been present for a lot of events.
You've got to hand it, right place, right time kind of thing.
But yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's done that right at the very end.
Which, I guess, credit to him for only doing it right towards the end.
But it's just
good job.
One of the only qualities you could lay at his feet was the companions are very, they aren't super attached to the Doctor, they're not super important, and like Ryan and Graham just leave, which I think pretty much everyone liked. But no, now Yaz is important and special,
and that has for a long time. I mean, it's certainly not a novel critique by any means, but it's certainly been one of my frustrations with the program. But I do think it's an interesting point to note that I think it does to varying degrees happen with all the companions, because there was a point, particularly when Moffat was the current showrunner, where I was of the mindset of like, this is a Moffatism, and I think arguably he does do it to a greater degree, because he's like Girl Who Waited, like he gives them like the epic names,
the Tumblr nicknames that you could like
whereas at least Davies never does that with
I think one thing Davies does that softens it is that his characters, how do I explain it? So the Doctor will usually consider them to be great in some capacity, but they're well characterized and likable enough that you like them as well. And then when they do something that is logistically impressive, like when Rose destroys all the Daleks, when Donna destroys all the Daleks. God, he really only had one trick of his.
When Martha threatens to destroy all the Daleks.
But when they do that, they earn it. They build up to it. Whereas with Moffat, his companions start as being logistically powerful.
They have an intrinsic...
Exactly, that's a much better way of putting it. They're intrinsically great. And you may argue, I mean, we'll get to this, I really don't like Amy, I'm kind of on Clara. You could argue that the Doctor then learns to appreciate them as people. I would disagree. I think they're generally not great characters, but you could still argue that. But you can't deny they start off, and in both instances he only really travels with them because they are intrinsically special in some way.
It's you had this crack in your wall, and that's given you so you've become important, and so I'm interested in you almost as a puzzle. I mean, this is a Matt Smith thing in particular.
Oh god, yeah.
That both Amy and Clara are essentially just puzzles to him, to a large degree, much more so Clara, but Amy still, it's like, oh, you've got this crack, and what did that do, and you grew up in this way, you're an interesting sort of puzzle for me to solve, which is arguably quite problematic, that the Doctor kind of just takes on these little trinkets, humans as trinkets to solve. Anyway, we've got way off.
Ahead of ourselves.
This is about aliens of London.
I'm going to go even further. This is also why Bill Potts is my favourite companion. Spoiler alert, because just totally normal person, well characterised, likeable, normal person, going on a journey. Tiny bit of specialness, but not even really. Like, her becoming a sort of water creature didn't save the day. That was just a small treat
just
for
a
her.
Nice thing that happened to her.
Bill Potts is actually... I would say I like most of the companions, but Bill is the only one who I actually love, and I think it is largely because of that. And I actually can't wait to get to Series 10 and talk about her, because I think she's horribly underrated.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think Series 10 as a whole is unfortunately massively underrated, because a lot of people stopped watching before Series 10 because Series 8 and 9 are not great.
And then Series 10 is easily one of the best seasons of the show.
I love Series 10 so much. But that's a ways off yet.
Yes. Okay, back to episode 4 of Series 1. I have one thing I want to mention. What did you think about Rose calling the Doctor gay?
Oh, Russell. Yeah.
But at least you know it wasn't homophobic in intent.
There are definitely, throughout Davies' run, there are a lot of... early 2000-isms combined with kind of Davies's general campness in his writing, and I don't know what I think about that line. Every time I watch it, I'm like, it kind of irks me. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that, because obviously when the episode airs, I was 5 or 6 or whatever, and so I'm not sure entirely whether at that time, obviously, undeniably, it has kind of, even as much as it was written by a gay man, it has homophobic adjacency at the very least. But the kind of language at that time, I do wonder whether it would be understood more detached from, as just being kind of the general usage of the term. I'm not quite sure how to explain.
Well, it is undeniably true to a 19-year-old in 2005.
Yes.
You call things gay at a drop of a hat. If anything, it's less realistic. She doesn't do it more often. And I do think it's a very difficult topic. But obviously, calling someone gay in a disparaging manner is undeniably homophobic.
Yeah.
But you know that is the character, not the show, because Russell T Davies is a gay man who is very campaigns extensively for gay rights and pushes for protections and stuff like that.
So it's a weird one of kind of, and it sort of is very much of the kind of cultural milieu of the early 2000s. And I think I can't remember whether I said this in the pod. It's episode 4. I've reached the point of not remembering what I've said previously. I mean, although for me, for me, that is not desperately. I mean, I forget what I said 5 minutes ago. So, but case in point, what was I saying?
The cultural milieu. Of
I was being pretentious. That's right. The Doctor Who at this period of time, particularly Series 1, actually, is aggressively early 2000s. Just overall. Even Series 2 and so on, still have a lot of early 2000s kind of vibes. Series 1, though, is so, it would be absolutely wild if somebody made that series now, because it would feel so culturally disconnected. Unless it was about the early 2000s, and then you'd be like, this is a masterful recreation of the early 2000s. And in some senses, that is to Davies's. Why does he have to have such a difficult name to turn into a possessive?
Get back to the point before you forget it.
To some degree, that's to his credit, in that he does capture that zeitgeist of the time, including the not great bits. There's a lot of media that is both contemporary to the time that it's depicting and also retroactive depictions that are very rose tinted glasses. And I think that's one thing Davies does do well. I mean, it's part of his kind of, he does this social commentary that's very subtle, in that it's not, I mean, not always, but obviously he does. I
think subtle is completely the wrong word for but he's very honest. I think that's the point. Like a thing when he writes Queer as Folk and It's a Sin, particularly Queer as Folk, actually, which is obviously, a drama about gay people in, I think, 1999, so this is a big fucking deal. And there's a couple of characters in there who are, of course, it starts with a 15-year-old boy going to a nightclub and sleeping with a few people, which is a thing that happens.
Yes,
and he doesn't shy away from it. And a lot of people criticised him for, it's well, surely that doesn't help with, gay people are paedophiles stereotype. It's this is what happens. Young gay men go to clubs, say they're 18, and they sleep with older people. That's how it happens. And he is very unapologetic about being honest. Which I do respect.
Well, I think that's an important place to do critique from, because if you're doing, in the example with Queer as Folk, it is not helpful. In fact, interestingly, there's a book, I haven't read it, it's a good place to start, isn't it? So there's a book that came out recently called Bad Gays, which is a basically a history of generally bad people who were also gay. And kind of the point it makes in sort of its raison d'etre is that it's not helpful to construct a kind of fight for justice and equality on the back of pretending that all minority group people are just great, swell people, because that's going, oh, they're not people, you know.
Exactly.
And so things like that of going, well, this did happen, and you know, in the case of the queer as folk thing, a lot of that's driven by the bigotry, by the exclusion, because there isn't a healthy avenue for young queer people to explore their identities, particularly at that time. That creates issues like that, but you can't do that critique unless you go, look, this did happen.
Here is the uncomfortable thing that is happening right now. And so I think ultimately my stance for things like this, when you hear language like that, you know, dated language and expressions, and, you know, I'm not sure, is calling someone gay in that context a slur? I mean, if it is, then I guess I shouldn't be saying it, but you know what I mean.
It's a weird one. Again, it's a weird one because I think, particularly in the early 2000s, and as I say, 2006, 2005, I was five. I don't know exactly the general kind of culture, but assuming that it hadn't changed loads by the time
I remember being a teenager, and holy shit, the word gay was deployed every other sentence, and I can't imagine it was better in 2005.
and so with that, I would say that was a really weird term in particular, because precisely because it wasn't sort of directly a slur, like, and it for a lot of people, it detached itself from the kind of homophobic. I mean, let's be clear here. For straight people, it detached itself from the homophobic.
Well, that's it, because it was used to insult gay people, like, sort of historically. Then it gets used so much, it just becomes a general. You know, these curtains are gay. Meaning you don't like the curtains. And the overwhelming majority, because I got called gay all the time in school, and asked people what's wrong with being gay, and they would go, nothing. What, do you think I'm homophobic? What? And they were really passionate about not being homophobic, and they truly believed gay people were entirely equal, but would still call things they didn't like gay because the word just meant something different to them. And to be clear, you know, regardless of that fact, you know, that may not make them homophobic, but they're still perpetuating this idea
to a atmosphere of homophobia, and so that's the thing that I think makes that sort of thing in this context in Doctor Who really slippery to grapple with, is that obviously if Rose just straight up turned to the Doctor and just called him a homophobic slur, which frankly, thinking about it, is hilarious, and I want to see that. But that would obviously be like, wow, she's a horrible person. But there is maybe scope in Doctor Who for exploring maybe the Doctor misjudging companions and bringing someone on and then being like, hold on, you're actually a terrible person. And you could use that to explore prejudice and bigotry, and like they could be really bad at dealing with aliens and be like, react really negatively to people who are visually different or obviously different from them. But equally, I don't know how much that would serve a particularly useful arc in Doctor Who, because it would be very superficial. I don't think it would be a very useful exploration of bigotry to just be like, hey, this person's horrible, and now the Doctor's going to leave them. You know, it's like, okay,
that's fair. Bigotry is bad. You know.
But this, where it's in a more of a abstract. We've now, I think, spoken about Aliens of London for more time
than we did Rose.
I think any of the other episodes.
Well, we've been talking about the you know, whether it's what we think about the Rose calling the Doctor gay for like 20 minutes.
Good portion of this thing. I mean, I think it's an interesting thing with watching and like I said, particularly Series 1. I think particularly Series 1 is very, very aggressively early 2000s in a way that Series 2 kind of is, but not nearly to the same extent. I do wonder whether that's maybe partly because Series 2, I think, spends less time on Earth. Whereas Series 1 is...
You never leave Earth's orbit. You're either on Earth or a satellite orbiting Earth.
Yeah, you literally never go to another planet proper. You go different times and things. So yeah, there's a very... I wonder, it'd be maybe slightly interesting to compare... This is an endeavour for another time, but to compare Pertwee's run with Series 1 and see whether there's any parallels, because obviously Pertwee's run particularly early on, I think he got the TARDIS fix later on.
His third season, I think.
Yeah, but certainly for his first two, or certainly for the first one anyway, he's on Earth the whole time. So I don't know, but equally Classic Who does not explore contemporary... I want to be careful. I say, like, Classic Who does explore contemporary issues, but it doesn't typically explore them through a domestic lens. Well, it never explores them through a domestic lens.
No,
so
it's always some alien analogy of like current politics or something like that.
Which is, great and interesting in and of itself. But yeah, I don't think you probably would see such a capture of the zeitgeist, other obviously than in the sense that Classic Who can quite often be quite misogynistic and at times quite racist.
Yes.
But that's not it trying to capture the zeitgeist.
That's just unintentionally. And I think that's honestly the main difference, actually. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. This isn't... I'm pretty sure there's one episode, I can't remember what slur it is, but the First Doctor uses, like, a racial slur in an episode just describing a group of people, and it's dropped in completely nonchalantly, and it's clearly... That's not the Doctor saying that, that's the writers saying that, because they don't know that what they just said was despicable. Whereas this is clearly a very deliberate, on the part of Russell T Davies, this is not okay, but this is how teenagers talk, so it's very carefully considered, and I do think that makes a difference. It's not being thrown in for the sake of it, or being thrown in carelessly without a second thought.
Well, it's what you get sometimes with that very irritating style of critique where people go, if a character says something, that's the same as the author saying
I want to punch anyone who makes that criticism.
Obviously, there are scenarios in which that's the case. There are scenarios in which it's very apparent that the character is... essentially just a vessel for the author's often horrible views, but but that's usually apparent through the way other characters interact with that character, or the story interacts with that character, and in as much as there's not a sort of obvious rebuttal of Rose in this scene in this episode. It's not like a consistent thing. It's not like she's constantly sort of being casually homophobic and nobody ever brings her up on it. Doctor Who, very, as much as obviously, like we say, the classic series has issues in this regard, Doctor Who certainly has invariably tried to critique bigotry and injustices and things like that, up to a point. So there's that kind of background of that. Whereas obviously in other things, if a character is just consistently unpleasant and no other character ever is like, hey, you're kind of an unpleasant person, then it's fair enough to say, or if all the characters behave in a certain way, then it's kind of fair to say, well, that's basically what the author thinks. But if the author's writing a character that is obviously meant to be a bad person, then you can't go, hey, they wrote a bad person, they must... And
it's also, and on that note, of course, Russell Davies is getting, he later will write Captain Jack Harkness, the omnisexual man who is at no point criticised or mocked for his, bisexuality. So you absolutely can't argue this is some sort of statement that writer hates gay people. It's clearly meant to capture the culture
at the time, which it does.
My kind of final thought on that is and not everyone agrees with this, and I totally understand why. Some people are just uncomfortable with hearing those things, But my thinking is, if it's of the time, if it is literally from 2005 and it is reflecting that, I'm comfortable watching that with a sense of distance, like, yeah, wow, people did say that. Thank God we don't do that anymore, or we do that less nowadays. If a show came out now and someone casually called something gay and no one challenged them on it, I'd be like, oh, come on, guy, don't, do better, writers. You can't contribute to all that. You must know better by this point, and you shouldn't be contributing to that. But in something like this, where it's old, those things weren't talked about as much, and it was so much more widespread. It doesn't make it okay, but I personally am comfortable watching it with that sense of distance.
And it's also not... it's not like she's seen a gay person and is going, well, you're a goddamn poof, aren't you? Like, that would be, even in retrospect, be like, that's not great. But it's the I mean, you made the point. On that point, we've gone...
That's an hour and 11 minutes.
Yeah, which I think is our longest episode.
That is easily our longest. Sorry, I leant really close to the recorder there. Sorry if my voice suddenly got very loud.
So on that sort of ramble that went largely completely off the topic of the actual episode and turned into a general musing on the media landscape...
if you don't like that, go listen to something else, because that will happen a lot.
And probably increasingly. So on that, thank you for listening to this episode of our Doctor Who retrospective. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will next episode be looking at the next episode. It's kind of redundant, that's the entire conceit of this podcast.
It's called World War 3. We'll be looking at World War 3 next time.
The episode, not the event. Goodbye.